Gentlemen, there's been a lot of talk about expectation lately. Expectation of what we should be able to do to win. People are expecting. People are expecting quite a bit. I see us winning out there tonight. I have no trouble seeing that. That is not what I'm expecting. I expect you boys to go out there and not take this team lightly, because I promise you, they're going to come at you with everything they've got. I expect you boys to execute.
Yes, sir.
Expect you boys to play football.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Clear eyes, full hearts, can't lose.
Can't lose!
You deserve this, do you understand?
Yes, sir.
You've earned this, the right to win. You put that in your head.
You too, Coach. Expect to win. You've earned that.
Neil, you've gone south of the border.
I have. I'm in Mexico City. And we decided to spend the month of November here because it felt like maybe a good time to get out of the country. Planning to return, but we'll see what happens.
This reminds me that Nancy and I actually left the country in 2001 after George W. Bush became president, and people started writing us. It was really right when most people had email, and people were writing us in Mexico, and we would have to use 5 pesos in an internet cafe or something like that. And they'd be like, did you really leave the country? Are you ever coming back? But you'll come back. You'll come back to be with us, right, Neil?
I mean, the plan is, but we're also keeping our eyes open.
Okay. All right. You took the gold bars. So Tuesday is the day we've been waiting for. Neil, we're in a tightly locked presidential race. It's all happening in the swing states, and they are either tied or within a point one way or another. The polling is completely frozen, and I would advise all of our viewers to simply stop following the polls. How about you?
I think that's right. There's clearly something, and we're going to learn a lot, obviously, in a couple of days, but there's something wrong with the polling. And I think that we just don't know what that is yet. And I mean, I don't know which way to say the polling is wrong, but I don't think that this is as close as the polls are indicating. We'll see. But I think we have a lot to learn about what's happening with polling. I mean, we've been talking about it for a while, but there seems to be some lessons here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think a lot of people get confused between the polling and the polling averages and the probabilities. For example, Nate Silver has the probability of Trump winning is 52%. And that means he's gamed the race any number of times, and 52% he comes up with a Trump win. But that doesn't actually mean that Trump's ahead, and people need to know that. So the simulated 538.com model for the House is also giving Republicans a slight edge, which I do not believe. Republicans are heavily favored to take the Senate, which I do believe, but there could be some surprises there. Neil, if there was a surprise, where would it be?
Florida, I think. Rick Scott losing potentially. Fingers crossed as a Floridian or someone who comes from there, and would love to see someone like Rick Scott sent packing. I don't think Colin Allred is going to pull it off in Texas. I mean, it's great seeing it so tight, but we're already starting to see those numbers move apart. And I just don't think that Democrats can quite get over that hump in Texas yet. But Florida seems like a place where it could happen. And I also think that I don't think Harris is going to win Florida, but I think it's in the realm of possibility in a way that I didn't think was the case a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, and then there are those, 1.2 million Puerto Rican votes in Florida that may have been influenced by what happened at Madison Square Garden. What do you think is the likelihood, Neil, that Latino voters generally and Puerto Rican voters in particular will have been swayed in a significant way by having their beautiful island called a garbage heap?
Well, I don't know how broadly this will have an effect on Latino voters. But I do think that this is having a measurable impact with Puerto Rican voters. So we're hearing this like anecdotally, I think a lot, and that seems to be quite large on social media, the sort of evidence for this being really, really poorly received among Puerto Rican voters, and that it's also been mobilizing for them. And so we'll see. And I think it's been really interesting to learn that, Puerto Rican voters are a sizable demographic, obviously in Florida and New York. I think probably most people knew that, but it was new to me to learn that they were such a sizable presence in Pennsylvania. And this may all come down to Pennsylvania. So a joke might be the thing that shapes this election. A joke.
Yeah, a joke. Yeah. And, I think this whole business of Republicans getting to say whatever they want and then saying it's a joke doesn't really fly with serious people. And it may fly on Twitter. And I think a lot of Republican strategists are way too involved with Twitter. They're way too involved with the social media. I think also the Madison Square Garden rally, of course, there was a great deal more than the garbage heap joke. But it also sort of became clear that a lot of MAGAs are confused about whether Puerto Ricans are American or not.
Yes. Not surprisingly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me that this is something they have confusion about, or even just ignorance, maybe is the better word for this. I think, back to the joke thing, it's not 2016 anymore, right? Like they started saying this in 2016. And I think to some degree that was an effective response on their part for a moment. But thankfully, most people sort of organized against this notion that was taking hold on the right, that everything's just a joke. I'm thinking of, Nikki Hemmer, our good friend, has written a lot of pieces about the way that humor or things that are really racist and homophobic and xenophobic have been coded as humor on the right. And that's a deliberate political strategy that's really part and parcel of a sort of fascist a fascist spirit that we've really seen take hold. But like it's 2024 and most people are savvy to what all this is. And I think that sort of defense of this stuff is just laughable, to choose a word at this point.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also agree with you that I was shocked that there are 500,000 Puerto Rican voters in the state of Pennsylvania. That I really did not know. And since we know that this is a turnout election, that this election is not as much about changing minds as it is about mobilizing people to actually get to the polls, that could be something that mobilizes people who might otherwise say, I'm at the end of my shift and I'm too tired to vote, or this election doesn't have anything to do with me, or both parties are the same. That actually this might be kind of a breakthrough moment where people say, actually, both parties aren't the same.
Right. I mean, that's the thing that I was seeing on sort of social media from Puerto Ricans who were sharing that, like, oh, this is what lit a fire under my uncles, right? Or this is what got my family group, who some of whom said they were going to vote for Trump, a lot of whom said they were didn't plan to vote. Like all of them now are organized to go vote for Harris.
Right.
I mean, those are anecdotes, but it does feel like there's enough of them that it's starting to feel like data points. And we'll see, especially if it's a tight election, those sort of anecdotal data points can tip the scales.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as I have some Puerto Rican people in my family, we've spent a fair amount of time in Puerto Rico in the past. And one of the things I really know about the place is that a lot of people do military service from the island, and people who have come from the island do military service. And so there is this sort of like patriotic core of people in Puerto Rico who I would say are not even moderate, are kind of conservative in many ways. And I think this was a real slap in the face.
That's such an interesting point, because that sort of patriotic pride that Puerto Ricans really hold, to be confronted with this racist awfulness that is about characterizing them as not part of America, it feels different from a lot of the normal Trump ugliness. And I don't think we should sort of like rank the different awful things that Trump has said, but in terms of like how it might be particularly catalyzing
Yeah.
for a demographic group that may or may not have been all that inclined to vote against him, you know, I think it'll certainly be one of our most fascinating data points, I think, when all is said and done.
I think that's right. Now, when we're watching Steve Kornacki on the big board next Tuesday and probably on Wednesday and Thursday too, one of the things I'm going to be keeping my eye on is the Senate race in Nebraska, where Dan Osborne, an independent, seems to be within striking distance of the Republican incumbent, Deb Fischer. And the polls, again, are all over the place on this, but the Economist YouGov poll, most recent one, had Fischer 7 points ahead of Osborne, but the New York Times Siena poll had the race tied. What do we think is up there?
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not inclined to treat one poll that seriously, especially when a lot of the other polling coming from the New York Times, I think, is really questionable. But clearly, it's a tight race in a place where Republicans should be doing really, really well. And so, is this indicative of larger national patterns? You know, I don't know, but I think a lot of pollsters, or maybe actually more, a lot of political analysts, are pointing to all these tight races in places that historically shouldn't be tight for Republicans, and even pointing to races where Democrats are up in sort of unexpected locations, and saying that that should be indicative of actually a big Harris win, whether or not, you know, the polls day to day are showing it tied, are very close. So I don't know that Deb Fischer's not going to lose Nebraska, right? But that she's having to run that she's in a race that's this close, I think might really speak to some real good numbers for Harris. We'll see. Did you see this commercial though for Fischer that used footage from New England instead of Nebraska? And then the thinking of it is that some low level, you know, political commercial maker like Googled NE fall, you know, and meant Nebraska, but instead got Northeast and just dumped this like Vermont scene into this commercial. It's pretty hilarious.
That is so incompetent. That is
Yeah.
so profoundly incompetent. And I do get that sense of the Republican Party right now, that having sort of ejected all kinds of people who worked for the party over the long haul, who were consultants over the long haul, that they've actually got a lot of people working for them in a variety of races who aren't very good at what they do. And, you know, that happened to Ron DeSantis. I mean, those weird things that were coming out of the Ron DeSantis campaign, you've sort of had the sense that most of his staff were like 22-year-old interns who'd just gotten out of a frat house or something.
Completely. I mean, you have a sense that this party is now held together with, you know, Scotch tape and a bunch of kooks, essentially.
Yeah.
And also, this is a party that may win the White House. So it's that sort of, I mean, you know, I think like social media really loves to rag on the ways that the Republican Party is falling apart organizationally.
Right.
You know, people love to put up these pictures and this footage of no one turning out for Trump's rallies. It doesn't matter who goes to the rallies. It matters how many people walk into a ballot box and pull a lever for this guy. And those two things, sadly, are not synonymous.
Right. And that there may be different things going on in different places. I mean, we know, for example, that Trump will win Nebraska, whatever happens in the Senate race. I think part of what's interesting, and we've talked about this a fair amount this fall, is I think we're beginning to see the emergence of more ticket splitting again.
Yeah.
And, you know, I sent Dan Osborne $25. I mean, why the hell not? Right. But I also think it's an interesting gambit, and we saw this in the last Senate cycle with Evan McMullin being run against Mike Lee in Utah, of Democrats saying, well, a Democrat can't win here, but an independent might be able to. And if you look at Osborne's webpage, there's, you know, respect for veterans and veterans affairs and fund education and Second Amendment is absolute. And, so there are this sort of mismatch of policies that sort of come together to make a moderate.
Yeah, and I think and one that doesn't have the the albatross of a democratic label, right?
Right, right.
But I think it also speaks to the power of that sort of, not just the power of the independent label, but that there is a large voting bloc out there, even in places like Utah and
Yep.
Nebraska, that is fed up
Mhm.
with this Trump Republican bullshit.
Yep.
And may they grow,
Right.
but it's interesting, especially that it's been in places like Nebraska and Utah, and maybe it can only happen in those places where Republicans have a lock on the politics, that a really viable independent candidate can emerge.
Right, right. And it would be interesting too, in terms of breaking this national narrative about a left and a right, that actually maybe voters can be pushing a little more towards the kinds of politics we used to have, which is you had a Republican who was sort of liberal on some things and very conservative on others. You had Democrats who were the same and so on. I don't think we're getting there anytime soon, but I think true independent candidates, and Osborne said, if you elect me to the Senate, I'm not going to caucus with either party. Well, that's naive. I mean, you
Right.
don't end up with any seats on committees. There's a range of problems with that. Nevertheless, it is a way of expressing your disgruntlement with politics as they are and really, committing to doing something about it. And I think it's kind of admirable.
Yeah, that's a sort of statement that actually probably plays well with every voter, right? Like the
Mhm.
Republican who wants to support you but doesn't want to imagine that you're actually going to be a Democrat once you show
Right.
up in Washington. The independent who sort of likes that independent spirit to it. He's
Right.
going to have to make an announcement if he were to win. He'll be holding a press conference and he'll declare which party he'll be caucusing with, because if he doesn't, as you say, then he's worthless.
Right.
But it makes sense as a sort of message for the campaign season.
Right. And of course, Nebraska needs a lot from him in terms of farm legislation
Yeah.
and so on. So, speaking of rural America, let's also look at Montana, where John Tester is in a lot of trouble, although he's still within striking distance. And that race is a really interesting example of how actually the candidate hasn't changed and the state has changed around him. What do you think is going to happen in that race?
I think he's going to lose, unfortunately. I think he's been such an admirable leader for the state of Montana in many ways. And I think, as you say, there's this fantastic New York Times article which came out maybe a month or so ago about this. And I was really interested in reading it when it came out at the time. But he's losing because Montana has been, all these Californians have moved to Montana.
Right.
And they're sort of more conservative than the average Montanan is, and more partisan.
Right.
And so this Democrat who's won in Montana based on his long-standing reputation there and name recognition is made vulnerable by an influx of people who are just going to vote, Republicans up and down the ballot. And that's a fascinating political development for a state. And I think we may see that happen in other places, but it's particularly interesting, I think, for a place like Montana and with a person like John Tester.
Well, and I think we're also going to see the Republican Party increasingly doing what they did in Montana, which is you import a candidate. I mean, he is not a Montanan.
Right.
He moved to the state. He's a very wealthy man. The Republican Party did this in Massachusetts this year. They're running some hedge fundy person from Connecticut against Elizabeth Warren, which is it's probably fruitless to run anyone against
Yeah.
Elizabeth Warren. So they were just putting in a placeholder. But they did it in Pennsylvania, both with Dr. Oz and now with Dave McCormick. Who is also a Connecticut hedge funder, Dr. Oz. We're not quite sure where he lives. We think he lives in New Jersey. So there is this sort of moving around of candidates, moving Blake Masters to
Yeah.
Arizona. So I think the Republican Party is sort of increasingly trying to figure out who are these candidates they can run for Senate, who can bring in a ton of money, who can self-fund and have their friends fund them. And I think we're going to see more of that in future election cycles. Yeah. So, Neil, let's get back ever so briefly to the Madison Square Garden rally, because the one question I wanted to ask you, and viewers, I wrote a piece about it earlier this week. You can go and take a look at it. So we're not going to describe the whole thing, but what do you think the Trump campaign thought it was doing by holding that rally? Because it really was kind of a shit show when it comes to enticing anybody who is a moderate to the Trump campaign at this point.
I honestly don't know, because it feels like a shot in the foot in a lot of ways. Like, why did you do this? Why did you spend all this money on it and this waste all this organizational energy right before the election? I do think there has been something strategic about Trump going into these places where he's not expected to win. I mean, he was doing a lot of stuff on Long Island, right, leading up to this, and showing a Trumpist presence in those places
Right.
as a message to the media and to the nation. That said, and I was very hesitant to agree to these sort of, or to align myself with this historical comparison that people were making for quite some time. But I actually think that there's a connection to the 1939 rally in the Madison Square Garden. I mean, Trump didn't put this thing together. His insiders did. And I think they are showing more and more their Nazi affiliations, or they're sort of, I think it's a nod to history. And I, again, was hesitant to embrace that view that a lot of historians were making, I think, several months ago when this was announced. Now that's happened, it does feel like Stephen Miller loves the direct comparison to 1939, and that's part of the thinking here. I mean,
Right.
am I wrong on that? Am I
No,
too far gone?
I don't think you're wrong. And I think part of what is striking to me, and this has been true for the entire campaign, is that the final model that the Trump campaign has broken is that model where you run to the right or the left, as it were, in the primary, and then you tack back to the center during the general. There has been no tack back to the center. There has only been a sort of continuous drumbeat appeal to the right wing fringe and a promise that a Trump presidency will address all of these far right desires, including, white supremacist policymaking around immigration, around women's bodies, around LGBT people. I think there is a really strong promise that, Ron DeSantis kept saying he would do for the United States what he did in Florida. I think people in the Trump campaign really listened to that. And even though DeSantis appeared to be the wrong national messenger for that, they have watched what has happened in Florida and they think that they can put that together for the whole United States. And I'm just guessing, I have no data here, but I cannot imagine any other reason why you would run a full on fascist rally in the last 10 days of the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. If you didn't intend exactly that. I think that's right. I mean, you don't back away from this stuff if that's what
Right.
the ultimate project is. And I mean, also this new the new news or the news recently of Elon Musk and saying that he and Trump have this plan to
Right.
crash the U.S. economy in the next 2 years,
Right.
and that once they've done so, that they will then rebuild the nation in the sort of MAGA structure that they imagine for it. I mean, they're plainly announcing everything they intend to do. And you're right, Claire, like this is not about appealing to the center, as every single presidential candidate has done from both parties for generations, but about running to the extreme and staking that ground out. And they're not kidding around.
Yeah, they're not kidding around. And of course, we've known for some time that the Trump strategy was to bring in voters that don't usually vote. I guess it's like lazy white boys playing video games at home, a variety of people like that. But it it seems like something like this was designed to sort of awaken the shy fascist vote. And it's quite a gamble because you're right. There is no way back from this. And I would say if Trump loses, the Republican Party collapses on some level. I mean, I think it's already collapsed, but that what exists now will not exist in the next election cycle.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to see, given everything given all the ways it's changed, both culturally, politically, ideologically, but also sort of, as we've been talking about, organizationally,
Right.
how it survives in the aftermath of a Trump loss. But is what comes afterwards, like a health, as a rebuilt party in the sort of shadow of its former self, or something totally different that still feels Trumpist? Like, I don't know, but let's certainly hope that that's the future scenario in which we're talking about the Republican Party as opposed to the alternative.
I think that's right. I think, if there is any kind of investigation of this campaign afterwards, by who? I don't know if if Harris wins, if there's a Democratic House, blah, blah, blah. I think there is tons and tons and tons of money changing hands under the auspices of the campaign. I think the Republican campaign is one big money laundering operation.
Yeah.
And I would love to staff that House committee as they work on that, which, by the way, they're still arresting January 6 people and arraigning them. I mean, so there's that. All right. So let's get to Kamala Harris before we turn to our viral things. She's becoming more and more presidential, I think.
Absolutely. I think the way the way the campaign has structured these last 2 weeks or so has seemed like such an absolute expert execution of how you roll out a candidate in the last days, particularly one who didn't have very long to present herself to the nation. I mean, this rally on the Mall was an unbelievable feat.
Yep.
Organizationally, symbolically, and her performance at it was truly a rock star performance. The campaign certainly couldn't be more happy with the way that I think she's performing and the way that the campaign is functioning. And to have 75,000 people turn out for that rally when I think they were expecting 30 to 40,000 is stunning. The images of it with her at the White House lit in the background, I mean, what a incredible, just symbolic evening. And I think you could really see something taking hold on Twitter that feels hopefully aligned with where the votes are headed on Tuesday. But it does feel, I think there's a sense of optimism, I think is maybe what I'm trying to say here.
Yes.
And I hope that optimism is coupled with a clear electoral win.
Yeah. Yeah. I am seeing that optimism too. I think particularly a lot of feminist journalists keep saying it's Rovember. It's Rovember. Don't forget that it's Rovember. And I am seeing some people like Joan Walsh and Helene Olin and so on saying that they think she's going to win big. I would love to see that. I'm not expecting that. I don't want to jinx anything, but I would have to say that the calls I've been making into Georgia in the last couple weeks, I am getting an unusually large number of people who saying either that they have voted, that they are going to vote, this is when I'm going to vote, this is how many people I'm taking with me. I think the ground game in Georgia is very, very, very good because, by the time I'm calling in, they've already been visited, they've already been canvassed, and so on and so forth. I'm also talking to a lot of men in Georgia, Black men, I believe, because I think those are the precincts we have. When I say, are you planning on voting for Vice President Harris? And they say, of course.
Hmm.
Like, there is a kind of movement among the men I'm talking to that is very heartening. And I would also like to say, I saw this in the newspaper today, but I have been seeing this on Twitter. There are an awful lot of Republican influencers putting fake polls out there
Yes.
and putting fake information out there to get people discouraged and demoralized. And if you check up on those things for like 2 seconds, you find out they're totally wrong or they don't line up with anything reputable you've seen. So I think Harris could do a lot better than people think she's going to, simply because there's been so much mixed information. And I think the Harris campaign is not actually exhibiting the kind of confidence that I believe they feel.
I agree. That's my feeling as well. I was hesitant to say that at the top of our conversation when we were talking about polling, but
Yep.
everything that I've seen over the last week, and also I think just sort of the mood of the electorate, and also historic trends that we see taking shape, I think they all indicate a big win for Kamala. And so I'll say that now.
Yeah.
And I do think your point about these Republican social media influencers who are putting out these, fake polls, and this also includes Elon Musk, who is
Hmm.
very much sowing disinformation into the social media sphere.
Yep.
It's not just about depressing people and confusing them. This is about putting into people's minds a different reality than actually is there, so that when she wins in a landslide, millions and millions of Americans are going to
Mhm.
believe that it can't be so. It only happened because they cheated, because the
Right.
polls showed it was so close right up until the election. And this just is more grounds for, Trump and the Trump team to do everything we know that they're going to do in
Yes.
challenging this election, because he's not going to win the popular vote. We'll see what happens with the Electoral College. But even if she clearly wins both, the Trump team has a whole legal strategy that they are ready to activate. And they'll be able to do that in large part because so many millions of Americans have been deceived about the political reality of right
Yep.
now.
Yep. Agree completely. And like you, I think she's going to win. I will commit to that. I don't know what happens if I'm wrong, but it's so much worse than me being wrong. I'm not even going to worry about it.
We've got an
Uh,
extra room here in Mexico City, so
Excellent. My go bag is packed. The dog is ready to come with us. So Neil, I'm going to let you go first on what you want to go viral this week. What is it?
I want to talk about this wonderful article in the New Yorker from Jasmine Hughes called "How Alpha Kappa Alpha Shaped Kamala Harris." This is such a fantastic piece. It's actually one of those really long New Yorker pieces. And it's sort of wonderful seeing the long form New Yorker article given to a topic like this.
Yes.
I wasn't surprised to see this piece in the New Yorker, but these topics tend to get more their 5 to 6 page treatment, whereas this is one
Right.
of the 8 to 10 pagers. It is a fascinating exploration of AKA, the nation's oldest and arguably most important, most influential Black sorority, one that has shaped so much of Black excellence in the 20th century. I mean, to see the alums from this organization is really to marvel at just all the ways in which every sector of American society seems to have someone who is involved in AKA. It's a fantastic history of the Black Greek system, and particularly of Howard University. I really appreciated the article for the ways it historicized Howard and AKA at Howard, and also Kamala as an undergraduate there in the early 80s. It's just wonderful. And one of the things that becomes really interesting in the piece is, I think like most sororities and most fraternities, AKA is famously tight-lipped, but perhaps even more so than the average fraternity or sorority. And so the piece is also a little bit about the sort of challenges of reporting on an organization where people are really proud of it, but are not willing to say that much about it. And that sort of becomes its own theme of the piece as well. But I just love this. I think if you're wanting to sort of stay engaged in politics, but also want something that's like not as dark as and heavy as everything feels right now, this is a great way to feel really connected to this election, and certainly one of the major one of the two candidates in it, but in a way that it feels so much more affirming and light and just fascinating. So please check it out. The piece from Jasmine Hughes in the New Yorker about Alpha Kappa Alpha.
I thought it was wonderful too, Neil. And I want to suggest to our viewers that if you like that article, go get Barbara Savage's new book. It's a biography of a woman named Mersey Tate, who was an academic at Howard University for many years, but actually was able to become who she was because of an Alpha Kappa Alpha scholarship. And as the article points out, people can join the sorority at different points in their lives. Yeah. It's not like these sororities where you rush when you're a freshman, and if you don't get in, that's it. And it's a really good example about how Black men and women had to build their own institutions. It's this self-consciously created elite, because you need an elite in order to lift everyone else up, in order to create institutions and so on. And I also thought part of what was interesting about Jasmine Hughes is she's much younger, and she expressed a lot of skepticism about this kind of elitism and some of the things that it contained, like colorism and exclusivity and so on. But she couldn't really make an argument against it either. So I think it raises a lot of very interesting questions about what might be useful about having elites.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Neil. That's a great one. So this week, I'm going to end with self-care here, with R.J. Cutler's new drop on Netflix, a documentary about Martha Stewart that was made with her full cooperation. I will cop to it that I am fascinated by Martha Stewart. I watched the CNN miniseries about her, but because this was done with Stewart's cooperation, he had access to letters she wrote and diaries and so on. So we actually learned some things about how she felt about her divorce and why she was so crushed by it. We learn about, in fact, how crushed she was by going to prison. And it's fascinating. It also sort of makes this argument for why women are treated so badly. She's the first self-made billionaire who's a woman in the United States. This is before Oprah. And people just go after her constantly. And yes, there are a variety of things you could say about why some people don't like Martha. She's famously critical. She is a perfectionist. She's very tight-lipped. But she's also brilliant. And she builds this company from nothing, really at a time when there's no such thing as a lifestyle influencer. And she invents the lifestyle influencer and then goes to the bank on it. But it's also about resilience. It's about reinvention. There's this moment when she's getting out of Alderson prison, where she was for 150 days. And she says, "It's the first time in my life I've ever had time to think and rest." And you also realize that becoming Martha Stewart, there's a cost to it.
Yeah.
But that said, as everybody's getting anxious about the election and trying to get through this next week, there are many beautiful shots of her very beautiful house and her very beautiful gardens and her very beautiful food and so on and so forth. So there's a great deal about it that is relaxing, and allows you to think about a world where only pretty things happen.
How about the dogs? Do they do stuff with their dogs?
The dogs make an appearance, including there's this moment after she's released from prison. She's wearing this knitted poncho,
Yeah.
which was made for her by an inmate. And then her first time back on television, when she gets the ankle bracelet off, she comes on stage with her dogs, and the dogs are actually also wearing knitted ponchos.
Amazing.
But there's also a lot in the end of it about her relationship with Snoop, which is fascinating. And they really become friends, and they are really playful with each other, and it's fun to watch.
Well, I'm a huge Martha head, so I cannot wait to watch this. It feels like exactly what we might need to distract ourselves with right now.
I know. I'm going right out to buy the latest issue of Martha Stewart Living.
There you go.
So, Neil, I'll see you on the other side.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And, I think we can do this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, will we know by the time we tape next? Because last time around, it wasn't until Saturday morning, right?
That's true.
So let's hope for a sooner decision around this, so that we know a lot earlier in the week.
I heard Pennsylvania by Wednesday afternoon.
Oh, from your lips.
I know. All right, my friend.
All right, bye-bye.
I'll see you then. Bye-bye.